Hello, it's Simon from Film Stories, and in this video I'm going to be exploring the way that movie directors dealt with, well, let's just say inverted commas, slightly difficult actors.
Film Stories. We would be honoured if you would join us.
I'm going to start all the way back with the original Superman film starring the late great Christopher Reeve and directed by the late great Richard Donner. Now, Richard Donner wasn't having the best of times at one stage with Gene Hackman, who was playing the character Lex Luthor in the film. And as another movie director, John Badham, reported in his excellent book, I'll Be in My Trailer, which he co-wrote with Craig Moderna. It's really worth digging out that. Donner was faced with a problem when Gene Hackman was cast as Lex Luthor, because Hackman was hairy. I mean, there's no way you can get around saying that. It was hairy. He was sporting a moustache. He had hair. And the character Lex Luthor does not have a moustache and doesn't have hair, at least that we could see. Hackman refused to shave off his facial foliage, and so Richard Donner had something of a problem there. What do you do? So he came up with some sublime movie directing tactic. How about this? He went down to the makeup and costume department and got them to put a fake moustache on his face. And then, when faced with Hackman on the first day of shooting, Richard Donner gave one of his leading actors a proposition. He said to Gene Hackman, "If you shave your moustache off, I'll shave mine." And Hackman eventually agreed and went first, shaved off his moustache. Apparently wasn't too happy about it, although I'm not Gene Hackman, so I can't tell you that for definite. And then he came back, and right in front of him, Richard Donner just peeled off his fake moustache. After a moment of stony silence, and how terrifying must have that moment of stony silence have been, Hackman eventually laughed, set about putting the definitive Lex Luthor, so far, I would argue, on screen. Let's stick with comic book movies and superhero movies for the second example. Blade Trinity. Oh, Blade Trinity. Directed by David S. Goyer, the leading man Wesley Snipes. And Wesley Snipes has refuted one or two of the things that have been said about his antics on the set of Blade Trinity. But, I mean, those antics are quite entertaining, really, as long as you didn't have to work there. So engrossed was he apparently with his character that he would sign notes to and from the director whilst on the production as from Blade. Snipes apparently spent the bulk of his time in his trailer as well. He wasn't coming out unless he absolutely had to, allegedly. I don't have the lawyers. Snipes, again, has put a different version of this forward. Now, his co-star in the film, one of them was Ryan Reynolds, an early role, really, for Ryan Reynolds. And he was having far more fun than you'd probably imagine, just basically filming his one half of the conversation by himself without Wesley Snipes opposite him to do the other part of it. Snipes apparently didn't have an awful lot of time for director David S. Goyer on the movie either. And Patton Oswalt has recalled this in an interview he gave with the website The AV Club. And Oswalt said that Snipes allegedly, quote, tried to strangle the director. And at the end of that particular day, Goyer and the cast, crew, just went off to let off steam. Apparently they went to a strip club and met a bunch of bikers. Goyer apparently offered to pay for all of the drinks of those bikers if they'd turn up the following day on the Blade Trinity set and pretend to be David Goyer's security guards, which they duly did. In the words of Patton Oswalt, Wesley freaked out and went back to his trailer. Wesley Snipes has a different version of this story. The stories of making Francis Ford Coppola's two of his most loved films, the original The Godfather and also Apocalypse Now, are intertwined with his leading man on both of those films, Marlon Brando. Now, Coppola had to fight, I mean, hammer and tooth, really, to get Marlon Brando cast in the original Godfather film. And Brando Goes the Story wasn't massively keen at first to star in it. Still, he transformed himself into the character Don Corleone for a test scene, and Paramount just gave the nod for Coppola to cast Marlon Brando in the film. Now, there's a bunch of stories in the world of how people found working with Marlon Brando. He, by reputation, wasn't necessarily one to be troubled by things like learning lines. And so cue cards were dotted around the set with the lines written on for Brando to read from. And Brando's reliance on cue cards apparently was down to the fact that he wanted his performance to be more spontaneous. So he'd look at the lines and then say his lines just a little bit more on gut instinct. And of course, when you look at the performances he put on screen, it's hard hard to grumble. Well, in the case of The Godfather and Apocalypse Now, I mean, The Island of Dr. Moreau from 1996, we could have another conversation about. But on the set of Apocalypse Now, there was a trickier challenge that Coppola faced because Marlon Brando turned up on set not in the best physical shape and unprepared for the pivotal role of Colonel Kurtz in that film. Brando had banked $3.5 million for his work as well. It was only going to be a brief role. They didn't have much time on the set. So there wasn't an awful lot that they could do to alter his body, really. This wasn't the days of 2019's The Irishman where you could just get the computers out and change things around. And so Coppola had to use him as he saw him. And so he dressed him in black and kept him mainly in the shadows with the exception of his face. The result of this was far better than expected. And the whole idea of Colonel Kurtz coming across as such an elusive figure in the film. You go back to Spielberg's Jaws and how they couldn't use the shark much because the mechanical shark wasn't working. As a result, the less you see in a weird way, the more effective it makes the shark in Jaws. You get a lot of that in Colonel Kurtz as well in Apocalypse Now. It didn't mean that there weren't problems. Coppola had to rework the ending of the film because Brando just wasn't really physically capable of shooting what was originally intended. But what you got as a result of all these minor little changes and bigger changes that had to be made was a cinema classic. On the set of the film Out to Sea, director Martha Coolidge was working with another legendary performer, the actor Walter Matthau. And in fact, she had Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon, a double bill to die for. I mean, The Odd Couple is a brilliant film. And, well, things weren't going particularly well because the script of Out to Sea required Walter Matthau to dance. And Walter Matthau did not want to dance and, as reportedly told his director, I will not be dancing in this movie. The problem that Martha Coolidge faced was she needed her leading man. She needed one of her leading men to dance. And so Coolidge had her work cut out to persuade him just to shoot what was necessary for the script. And she told John Badham for that aforementioned book, I went out and found myself the cutest, most darling female choreographer I could find. And it worked, and he danced, and he was great. As Coolidge would discover, Matthau's initial instinct was sometimes to say no before ceding to a request a couple of takes down the line. And it turns out, in the case of Out to Sea, it's just one of the nicest scenes in the film. A director who really goes for it with his movies is Paul Verhoeven, and that was certainly the case with arguably his last great American film, Starship Troopers, film that's now revered in the way it probably should have been when it came out. Now, Paul Verhoeven has never been shy about nudity in his films, from Basic Instinct to Showgirls to RoboCop, and so it was a surprise to absolutely nobody when it came to shooting Starship Troopers with a young cast that he wanted that cast, led by Casper Van Dien and Dina Meyer, to take their clothes off for a shower scene. Now, in an interview at the time, Dina Meyer recalled that when she questioned him as to why the actors needed to be nude for the scene, Verhoeven just said it was typical of an American actress to be uptight about nudity. Meyer hit back. She said, I told him if it was so natural, why weren't he and his crew naked? There is a very real lesson to be learned to this story, and the moral of it, friends, is this. Be careful what you wish for, because Paul Verhoeven duly took his kecks off, with some of the crew also following his lead. As Casper Van Dien recalled, quote, it wasn't a pretty sight, going on to say, we agreed to strip down immediately on the condition that they all put their clothes back on. Classic film, and Verhoeven got his scene. Stories of Warren Beatty on movie sets rarely paint the actor as a man in a hurry. And in the film Splendour in the Grass, which he made with Elia Kazan, that was sort of the case as well. He'd worked with Hal Ashby on Shampoo, and there had been problems. Peter Chelsom on Town and Country as well. And so, I mean, Beatty has a reputation really for taking control, not always fighting his director's corner as well. And so Splendour in the Grass goes all the way back to the 1960s, very early in Warren Beatty's Beatty's career, and he was cast opposite Natalie Wood. Now, Elia Kazan was said to have been something of a mentor figure to Warren Beatty, and so he was able to stand up to him. He was able to make his point. And on the first week of shooting, there was a confrontation of sorts, that Beatty was said to have lost his temper with Elia Kazan and made reference to Kazan's infamous testimony before the House Committee on Un-American Activities. This is a topic so rich I couldn't even begin to give you a précis of it here. It's just well worth looking up, and just how that made Elia Kazan such a contentious figure. For Kazan, on the first week of his shoot, he needed to quickly re-establish his authority on the set of this film. But also he was really angry, apparently, at Beatty hitting his weak point in front of the cast and crew. And so he took his leading man's arm, and as Peter Biskin's biography of Warren Beatty explains, Kazan dragged Beatty off to a tiny dressing room, and for the next 2 hours, Kazan, quote, proceeded to justify himself before filming could restart on Splendor in the Grass. Now, it was 2 years later as well that Kazan wrote to Beatty about reports of his behaviour on another film set, and this was published in a book called The Selected Letters of Elia Kazan. And he wrote to Warren Beatty, "It's very regrettable that so many people think of you as a special problem. You have so much intelligence, talent, sensitivity. You're handsome, vigorous, physically able." God, it's my memoir, this. "But all this can be mollified or badly handicapped by the type of stories, true, part true, quite false, whatever, that have been getting back to me here." Beatty has since called Kazan the man who gave him, quote, "the most important break in his career." Next up, let's go to 1958 and how Henry Hathaway dealt with Dennis Hopper on the film From Hell to Texas. Now, the early stories of the late Dennis Hopper make for eye-popping reading, and that's even before you get to the tale of him making his, modern classic really, Easy Rider. Now, Hopper's assorted addictions reportedly didn't make him the easiest person to work with, and that was at the best of times. And when he became friends with James Dean on the set of Rebel Without a Cause, it did nothing to deflate things, really. And so, Henry Hathaway, a director who'd go on to make the John Wayne favourite True Grit as well. He would feel the brunt of Dennis Hopper not at his best while making From Hell to Texas. Now, Hathaway as a director described as very much in the style of old Hollywood. Dennis Hopper was breaking through very much as new Hollywood. And as was described, he figured he was the greatest young actor in the world when we made a picture together in 1958. Hathaway described, however, Hopper as a headstrong kid full of dope and bull something. Bottom line here, they just did not get on. This was not a director and star destined to exchange Christmas cards. And when Hathaway wasn't happy with the way Hopper was playing a particular scene, his technique, you're just doing it again and again and again and again and again. He ordered take after take after take. Hopper would not deviate from his refusal to shoot the scene the way his director wanted it. Hathaway, again. And apparently they shot this one scene from 9 in the morning until 10 at night, until Dennis Hopper eventually blinked first and shot the scene as Hathaway wanted it. As soon as the film had wrapped as well, Dennis Hopper was released from his studio contract, and a couple of years later, he'd make Easy Rider. It wouldn't turn out to be the worst ending for him. Not the most remembered 1970s movie next. Let's talk about Maidstone. And this was a clash between director Norman Mailer and his star Rip Torn. And so even if the film wasn't particularly remembered, the clash has been really. That Rip Torn just didn't really, allegedly, like the way Norman Mailer was directing the film, to the point where he decided to attack him with a hammer. Now, I'm sure this was provoked, or was it? I don't know. I wasn't there. But Norman Mailer did not mull for a long time on what is the best way to deal with his star in this case. And so he decided, do not try this at home, I'm not endorsing it, to bite Rip Torn's ear. Yeah. Mailer, to be fair, he didn't waste this because they were shooting a scene. Cameras got on, and what you got was the fight taking place in front of these cameras, and it makes it into the final cut of the film. Now, 1994's rom-com-ish, I wouldn't really call it a rom-com, I Love Trouble, directed by Charles Shire, and it would be fair to say, in the terms of romantic comedies, romantic dramas, whoever decided to team Julia Roberts and Nick Nolte should not have been invited to the Christmas party that year. They famously didn't get on at all. In fact, it's tricky to think of a couple in a romantic film who look as ill-suited together as those two. And so, even though more positive noises have been made in recent times, the story at the point of shooting was they were barely able to stand each other's company. And there's Charles Shire in the midst of it, having to direct this film written by Nancy Myers that, I mean, relied on them having chemistry, relied on them being in the same scene together. And so it took a report from the Los Angeles Times in 1994 to bring to light just some of the tactics, because Nolte and Roberts were also apparently frustrated with Shire about the idea of his continued request to improvise kind of like the same lines. And so what Shire did was he realised in the end, I can't win this. And he used old school technique that instead of shooting his actors together, he just kept them as far apart as possible. He shot them separately wherever he possibly could and got slightly happier performances out of the pair as a result of that. Now, what this meant was he also had to change the film because this was supposed to be a romance. This whole idea, almost like an old style story of warring newspaper reporters just fighting each other for the best story. And so rather than turn it into the romance as it had been written, as they were intending to make, they decided to make it more of a comedy instead. Gotta tell you, it didn't really work. The set of 1995's Batman Forever doesn't sound like the most fun place. Directed by Joel Schumacher. I mean, you could have, you could get an hour straight away out of Tommy Lee Jones and Jim Carrey apparently not getting on. Tommy Lee Jones infamously was said to have said of Jim Carrey, "I cannot sanction your buffoonery," which remains, that's what I want on my tombstone, really. But it's also no secret, really, that Schumacher didn't get on particularly wonderfully with his Batman, Val Kilmer, on the set of the film. And while Schumacher would subsequently go on to say that he feels that Kilmer was the best big screen Batman to date, this was before Christopher Nolan tackled his Dark Knight trilogy, it does show that, you know, Schumacher and Kilmer did reconcile to some degree before Schumacher passed. But it was a troubled set. And Schumacher apparently grew more and more frustrated with Kilmer's behaviour, so he decided to act. And after allegedly witnessing Kilmer treating people, let's just say, less well on the set than perhaps he should have done, Schumacher was said to have given Batman, in front of everyone, a pretty public dressing down, which led to the pair not speaking for a fortnight, a period of time that Joel Schumacher would describe as, quote, blissful. It's not the most productive tactic, granted, to just haul your star in front of everyone. But in the case of getting Batman Forever into cinemas on time, it's the one that Joel Schumacher successfully opted for. Let's do a bit of James Bond, and let's go to On Her Majesty's Secret Service, starring George Lazenby, who of course would only play the role of James Bond 007 on one occasion. It's now regarded as one of the very best Bond films. The more recent No Time to Die certainly leans heavily towards it, but it was not an easy production. And I mean, Lazenby was said to have been at the heart of some of the problems, allegedly. As the story goes, and there's a terrific interview with Peter Hunt at the Commander Bond website, it sort of went to Lazenby's head a little bit. And Lazenby, for his part, has suggested he wasn't really directed by Peter Hunt in the movie, but Hunt has refuted that, saying it's impossible. Of course he was directed. And furthermore, when he was up against things that his leading man was struggling with, Peter Hunt had to deploy more extreme tactics. And so in the interview with the Commander Bond website, what Hunt said is one of the best things he ever did was when Diana Rigg's character in the film is shot. We got up there at 8 in the morning, and he said, I insisted he, George Lazenby, was on set. I sat him in the car and made him rehearse and rehearse and rehearse all day long. And as Hunt says, I broke him down until he was absolutely exhausted. By the time we shot it at 5 o'clock, many hours after Lazenby had been called to the set, he was exhausted. And that's how I got the performance. Hunt said that he thought that it was me being unpleasant to him, but in Hunt's eyes, it was the way that he could get what he needed out of Lazenby. Burt Reynolds infamously fired his agent after making the film Boogie Nights for director Paul Thomas Anderson. And one of the films he made after that was a movie called A Bunch of Amateurs with director Andy Cardiff. The firing of his agent, actually, I mean, it might be an old wives' tale, might be just one of those mythical stories, but it was said to have been something that affected whether people voted for him for a Best Supporting Actor Oscar. He was certainly nominated for the role. He didn't win. He probably should have won as well. But in the case of A Bunch of Amateurs, this was a small comedy that was made in the UK. Reynolds apparently won very few friends on the set. And Andy Cardiff found that his leading man allegedly had not learnt his lines. And so he had little choice but to take the Marlon Brando tactic and get the cue cards out. And even then, Cardiff was said to have had to coax Reynolds out of his trailer to complete his work. And I mean, it's a decent, fun little movie as well. But kind of old school tricks were needed to get the performance from basically the star of the film. Let's do one more. Let's do an all-time classic, The Manchurian Candidate. The original version, directed by John Frankenheimer and starring Frank Sinatra. Now, Sinatra, obviously, his legendary career as a singer, as well as his lifestyle, actually meant he was more of a creature of the night than the morning. But when you're making films, well, some of them are made in the morning, and certain sequences for The Manchurian Candidate were made in the morning. So when there was an early morning call, Frank Sinatra was not likely to be there at the time he was supposed to be. And he wasn't also a fan of doing more than one take. Once he put his performance in the camera, he was happy. He was happy to move on. John Frankenheimer was not. And so they came up with a tactic for this. They had a conversation to tackle these problems. And so they agreed, first of all, on 2 weeks of rehearsal before shooting. Now, the idea here was to minimise the amount of takes that Sinatra would have to do. So Sinatra agreed to this. They'd do a quick run through of the shot before Frankenheimer took a take as well. And hopefully that would result in fewer times having to do it. But also Sinatra suggested to John Frankenheimer, let's change the shooting day. Let's not make it an 8, 9 o'clock start. Let's run it from 12 noon until 8 p.m. rather than starting early in the morning. And you know what? This kind of compromise between one and the other worked, because that's what happened. Shooting would start at 12, be done at 8. And so the rehearsals were what Frankenheimer needed to get the performance out of Sinatra. Sinatra needed the later shooting time in order to basically get out of bed and be ready. It would be one of the best films the pair had worked on together. If you look through all of the stories that I've just talked about, imagine if the director and the star just come up, knock their heads together and come up with an answer that worked. Would have saved each other a lot of headaches. If you have liked this video, please leave comments and do things that you're supposed to do on things like that. I still don't quite understand all the videos, as you can probably tell. If you can like and subscribe, hugely appreciated. I'll be back.